Tautological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. It is fun to consider that philosophy can be captured in an encyclopedic tome meant for academic experts, as well as in a sliver of fictional storytelling. Over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at some of the reoccurring characters in the most famous fables of all, Aesop's. In each episode, we'll look at several fables about our featured critter, the moral of those fables, and we'll take a deeper look at how they tie together. Today, we're looking at the fox. So Aesop's fables, pretty much everybody is familiar with them. And I know when you hear them growing up and things. Right. And I just always had the assumption that, they're meant for kids or whatever. And then I remember finding the actual Aesop's Fables book on my dad's shelf when I want to say 19 or 20, something like that. And I just read through the whole book. I was just fascinated by them. I thought, oh, these are not really for children. Like it's really, it can be for anybody. But I think that it's just the animal characters, which is what we're going to focus on in the series, because I think that there's a lot of fascinating elements and questions that sort of surround them.
Right.
But
what we associate with each animal just generally.
Yeah. And those are some questions we'll ask at the end. Yeah. So we'll start by reading the fables. So we'll trade off and we'll just kind of talk about them.
Yep.
And I'll start with the first one, which I have. We each picked 4 of them. Yep. So I'll read one of the ones that I picked, and then you can read one. The first one that I picked was The Fox and the Bramble. So The Fox and the Bramble goes, a fox was mounting a hedge when he lost his footing and caught hold of a bramble to save himself. Having pricked and grievously torn the soles of his feet, he accused the bramble because when he had fled to her for assistance, she had used him worse than the hedge itself. The bramble, interrupting him, said, but you really must have been out of your senses to fasten yourself on me, who am myself always accustomed to fastening upon others. So I really like that story. And one thing I found as I was reading through these is the specific site that you sent me to that has a really encompassing collection of these fables. Yeah. Was it spells out the accompanying moral with it. And one thing I found as I was reading these, and I think what makes Aesop's Fables really interesting, is that, I read the fable and then I'd read the moral that they're explicitly telling me is attached with it. And then I always found myself finding other things in the story that it might have been about. And that's where the philosophy of these little snippets of stories comes in. So the sort of explicit moral to this story, The Fox and the Bramble, is to the selfish, everyone is selfish, right? And you can see that. The fox finds himself in this bad way. And so in his desperation, he reaches out to save himself, gets hurt in the process. And then rather than thinking, oh, wow, grabbing onto this saved me, instead, his reaction is, hey, I hurt my foot on this thing. What were you? I needed help and you did this to me, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good moral.
It is.
But I think there's another aspect to it, too, that I sort of keyed in on, which was beware of who you trust as well, right? So,
I think so. I think that, and what you said about the explicit moral certainly is explicit. It's obvious. It's there. But be careful who you trust. It implies that if you're in a bad situation, don't necessarily take the immediate first way out. If there are other possible ways at the same time.
Yeah.
And if you do, accept that it's not necessarily going to go well either.
Yeah, I think that if we extrapolate this story out to, like a more human scenario, right? If you're doing something in your everyday life and you come up against a hard time, if like you said, if the first thing that you reach out to, the first person that you reach out to for help is somebody that is, basically known to be toxic or toxic by nature, you don't really have a right to be mad at them for harming you in some way when you should have known better than to reach out for help.
Right. Yeah, because you're abandoning all sense. In other words, you're panicking. Right. Okay, we all get in situations where panic would be necessary or totally understandable. But panic doesn't help anything, of course, and we can stand away from that and know that. But yeah, there's a blame thing going on, and to me, this is an example of consequentialism. If you take an action and it turns out well, it was the right action to take, and if it turns out badly, then perhaps it wasn't the right action to take. Well, it still turned out well. He got off the other.
Yeah, and I think that this is where a Stoic philosophy would be appropriate if you're the fox, right? Hey, listen, life is hard. You're going to come up, everybody's going to come across situations, whether you're a fox in a hedge or a human in a financial situation or a life and death situation where, like I said, life or death, you're panicking. You just take the first action you can to survive.
Yep.
And the Stoics would say, well, you survived,
right.
Good job. There's no point in looking at the
thorns in you.
Right, there's no point in looking at that. The point is that you survived.
Sit down and pull the thorns out and shush.
Right. So, yeah, it's this it's this perspective shift on the outcomes, right? Rather than being grateful that he survived this scenario, he's looking at it and saying, well, hey, I hurt my foot on this bramble, it's...
There's also a thing that goes on with Aesop that, and by the way, when we talk about it, if we talk about it, there's virtually no evidence that Aesop existed. We'll get to that, but the way the story begins, you in your mind, in my mind, I said, no, wait a minute, what's he doing in the hedge in the first place? There's this whole thing that's gone on beforehand.
Yeah.
Why would you go into a hedge? Was a hunter after you? Was an apex predator after you?
Yeah, and the fables, and that is another part where the philosophy and the imagination of the story comes in. Is some of these fables, they'll spell it out for you, what was happening, but sometimes they are. You're in this situation, and the one that sticks out to me, then I don't think any of us picked it, but it was the fox and the goat. And it says, a fox was in a well and a goat comes to help him. Yes. And the fox says, hey, if you jump down here, hey, yeah, the water's good. Come in. The goat comes in. Well, hey, now we're both stuck. The fox says, well, if you let me jump up on your back, I can get out and pull you out. The goat lets him do it. And then the fox takes off. And the goat says, wait, you were supposed to help me. And the fox says, well, you should have looked before you leaped and not come down here with no way out. Well, you were in the bottom of the well to begin with, so what happened here? Right?
What stupid thing did you do, Fox? Or what accident happened that maybe was unavoidable? It's always Fox that's usually avoidable.
Yeah.
That's the nature of the character itself. And in any folktale system, from the Greeks to the indigenous cultures, the fox is usually at best a trickster.
Right. Yeah, so this is something we'll get into at the end after we've read through all the fables. Okay. But let's move on to the next one. So this is yours, and the one you picked for this was the fox and the leopard.
The fox and the leopard. Here we are. The fox and the leopard disputed which was the more beautiful of the two. The leopard exhibited one by one the various spots which decorated his skin, but the fox, interrupting him, said, "And how much more beautiful than you am I, who am decorated not in body, but in mind."
Yeah, so this is another one, right? So the explicit moral is brains over beauty, essentially, right? So it's better to be smart than to look good. But again, there's that thing in the back of my head that's saying, well, there's an arrogance here as well that almost cancels out the message of saying that being smart is better than being beautiful. So
right, exactly. Well, and for me, of course, it's so look. I mean, this is a side note, but I have said to my granddaughter many times, because she'll look at age spots on me, and I've got a particularly larger one on my hand, and she'll call it a boo-boo, and I say, no, it's not a boo-boo. It's just I tell her I'm turning into a leopard. and someday you'll have lots of those spots. I said, I'm already getting them. That's it, But I don't find them particularly beautiful, So the notion that just because it's ostentatious that it's automatically beautiful renders a shallowness perhaps to both of the characters. Okay, it's showy. Showy can be fun. Ostentatious is fun sometimes, but that doesn't mean it's the only beautiful. And so the fox wanting to prove, as always, that the fox is better somehow. It is arrogant.
Yeah. And that, I mean, this raises the whole idea of aesthetics, in beauty. And especially, I mean, you mentioned the human part of it. You have age spots, right? I'm covered with freckles. And I always remembered growing up hating them. And there was all these old Irish ladies that loved them. And so, your idea of what's beautiful, right? Or, okay, well, how come, having hair on your head is beautiful, but then having hair over the rest of your body is not. Right? So who's making these rules? Right?
Exactly.
How is this,
Exactly. Who's making this rule? Fox.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is a sort of a trope that you see throughout the fox's stories, is that the fox is smart. He does have brains. But rather than it being, this thought out or rational sort of approach, it's a very instinctual, witty, fast-paced thing that is more about maneuvering and, sleight of hand and changing perspective than it is something of substance.
Right, exactly. Because there, again, I'm at the, what the heck are fox and leopard doing together anyway? Let's just go walking together. What? It seems to me that there's a potential for great danger in that situation.
Yeah.
And so to be walking along with a leopard and then say, oh, but I have the better mind.
Right. It seems like you're asking for trouble there. But yeah, so I think that one is interesting.
Yep.
So the next one that I had here was the fox and the crow. So a crow, having stolen a bit of meat, perched in a tree and held it in her beak. A fox, seeing this, longed to possess the meat himself, and by a wily stratagem succeeded. How handsome is the crow, he exclaimed, in the beauty of her shape and in the fairness of her complexion. Oh, if her voice were only equal to her beauty, she would deservedly be considered the queen of the birds. This he said deceitfully, but the crow, anxious to refute the reflection cast upon her voice, set up a loud caw and dropped the flesh. The fox quickly picked it up and thus addressed the crow. My good crow, your voice is right enough, but your wit is wanting. So again, classic fox, right? And in this case, is taking the opposite approach that it did with the leopard, pretty much. Saying, oh, wow, you're so beautiful and great. Man, if just your voice was better, you'd be great. And this sort of goads the crow into releasing the meat.
You can see these happening. A part of the brilliance of these, I think, is that because I have lots of crows. I love crows. Every morning a crow is on the top of a spruce tree outside my house, waking me up. You can see it going, and dropping the meat just like that.
Yeah.
So there's a natural appeal in this. But yeah, he's just, the other thing, and we'll get to it, but just to put a little bookmarker on this, it seems to me funny in a kind of Abbott and Costello, going back to the earliest kinds of comedy in the country, that as we're applying this to ourselves, vaudeville kinds of things. How many times can the fox trick you when you'll say, oh, do it again? Well, this is where the Charlie Brown stuff comes. But here, Charlie Brown, I'll hold the ball and you'll kick it.
Right.
What?
Yeah. So the explicit moral in this story is don't trust flatterers, right? And you can see that as a decent moral, right? If you're walking around your everyday life and somebody just comes up to you and starts telling you how wonderful you are for no apparent reason, heck, maybe they're really nice, genuine people, but maybe there's an ulterior motive. The other one that I saw in there was don't be hasty to prove yourself to others, right?
Yes.
So here's the thing is like the crow, regardless of what the crow thinks about its voice, it still would have had its lunch if it didn't value the fox's opinion of its voice.
Exactly.
Right? And so I feel like that's also kind of an important lesson.
It is. Eat your lunch and then crow. Just a minute. Okay. No, we have to do it instantly. It's all. I think there's an overarching thing going on here, which we can get back to too, but which is as you mentioned earlier, it's the immediacy. The instantaneous decision is generally not the best decision to make.
Yeah, not only, and in some cases, like with the fox in the hedge, that instantaneous decision, you might look back at it and say, oh, well, I could have taken this different route and not stepped on a bramble or whatever. But you're in a life or death situation. You're in the moment and you just do the best you can. But then in something like this, it's really pretty apparent that, the crow could have taken a moment and then said, well, what does the fox say? Right. And in addition to being a viral song, we all know that it's not pretty itself, right? If you would have just taken the second to turn the table, maybe that would have calmed your anger down, or that instinct that you suddenly needed to prove yourself, right? Yeah. So if somebody's coming at you and saying, oh, well, you don't do this thing so well, and then they don't do that thing so well, maybe there's something else going on there, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the next one we have is a classic, and that is The Fox and the Grapes. This might be, this is probably the most famous Aesop's fable, you think?
I think it's one of them. Yeah. I do. Perhaps the most, I think probably the most familiar. A famished fox saw some clusters of ripe black grapes hanging from a trellised vine. She resorted to all her tricks to get at them, but wearied herself in vain, for she could not reach them. At last she turned away, hiding her disappointment and saying, "The grapes are sour and not ripe as I thought."
So the explicit moral here is, of course, it's easy to despise something that you can't have.
Yep.
And I think that we all do that. And you know what? I think that it's difficult, right? Because it's sort of a tricky line to walk. Because I think that when trying to project into the future with some things, right? Trying to decide on a course of action, we're always weighing these pros and cons.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no way of knowing really whether we make right or wrong choices, because we only know what happens when we make the one that we made. But sometimes we make the one that we made, right? And then, we progress down that path, and maybe that path didn't turn out as well as we thought.
Yeah.
So then, in order to sort of provide some comfort, to reduce our cognitive dissonance in the idea that we made the wrong decision, we start to reevaluate the other path and start to think of more things that could have gone wrong there, and say, well, you know what, at least I'm here instead of there.
Yeah.
And and that's the thing, is there's no way of knowing. Maybe all of those bad things would have happened and you did make the right choice, but maybe it would have turned out better. But I think it's it's sort of an ingrained part of human psychology.
It's very human. And also for me with this tropish, because it is so familiar story, all people have to say is sour grapes. And they've essentially alluded to the small but whole story. It is that we have this inherent need to be right. Well, I knew that was going to happen. I think at one moment or other, we all say it when we're trying something new and it doesn't go quite well. I figured. Well, to Western New York is I figured that would happen.
Yeah.
No, you didn't. No, you wouldn't have done it in the first place.
Yeah.
But you do it to comfort yourself. You do it because you want it to be prescient. You want it to be, I did a cost-benefit analysis and it turns out I was right. The reverse engineering of the decision is precisely the wrong way to go about making decisions.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and what's the value in that for an individual, right? Is it to not pursue a course of action that it might not be beneficial in the future? It's like, what's the drive to always have that that idea that we knew,
I don't, and I think we've touched on this in a number of different episodes, but this is the part where I always think, how did we manage to evolve at all? Well, there's millions of years of trial and error. Who knows what everything was like and how many mistakes and how many just dead ends happened. We know a few of them or think we do. So yeah, it's rather than saying, yep, that didn't work and go on with it. It's, yep, I knew that wasn't going to work. And so will you go on and try to get grapes the next time? Maybe not, even if the grapes were good for you, even though ultimately the effort was probably worth it. And for me, that can be extrapolated in all kinds of things. Oh, we put a ship up in the air, and once in a while there's this horrific event because we're working at the edge of known physics and science, and sooner or later something bad is probably going to happen, just in probability terms. But then we just shut everything down. Nope, guess we won't do that for a while. Nope, it's because we knew it was going to happen sooner or later, rather than, yep, that happened, we're going to move on. And then what I'm thinking about with that is two things: the Apollo program, and then the space shuttle program. The exploration of space versus the trucking of things from one place to another at the edge of space. And that doesn't diminish the lives lost at all, but how we responded to the Challenger, which maybe a lot of people don't even know about anymore, but explosion with a tremendously fascinating crew aboard, was to just do a deep analysis and rethink and just pause or stall the program for a long time. There was a terrible event with a fire in an earlier Apollo ship, and 3 astronauts died in a fire on the pad, but they continued with Apollo. And so this story brings that kind of stuff to mind.
Yeah, I think that, another one that pops to my head is nuclear energy, right? And in that idea, it's different, right? Rather than having a tragedy that's shutting it down. I guess it's similar, right? You had Chernobyl and you had 3 Mile Island and these things. But it requires a long view, right? So if you understand that you have climate change and global warming issues, and you understand fossil fuels are contributing to that, and you know the dangers, and the things that go along with nuclear energy, maybe perhaps rather than looking to nuclear energy as being the savior of the planet, you look at it as being a step between fossil fuels and renewable resources, right? And you think, okay, well, this isn't perfect, but it's needed to reduce emissions, and maybe we use it for 10, 20, 30 years before we get our wind and solar and hydro up to an efficiency and a scale that works for the planet.
And now we're warming up, because to me, you just took me back to the fox and the bramble.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You step on a bramble once at Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, and you say, oh,
how could you do this to me?
Right.
Well, why wouldn't you think that I would? This is my nature. I can bite back. Mm-hmm. This is the joy of these small tales, these fables, these animal stories, that we can encapsulate an event, not erase the event, but say, okay, let's just look at it from a metaphorical, figurative distance, and see what we learn.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the Fox and the Grapes is fantastic for that, because of all the reasons that we just mentioned. You can extrapolate that. You can think of personal instances where it's happened for yourself, and you can extrapolate it to the whole of humanity, and it still holds the same meaning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So the next one we have is the fox who had lost his tail. A fox caught in a trap escaped, but in so doing lost his tail. Thereafter, feeling his life a burden from the shame and ridicule to which he was exposed, he schemed to convince all the other foxes that being tailless was much more attractive, thus making up for his own deprivation. He assembled a good many foxes and publicly advised them to cut off their tails, saying that they would not only look much better without them, but that they would get rid of the weight of the brush, which was a very great inconvenience. One of them interrupted him, saying, "If you had not yourself lost your tail, my friend, you would not thus counsel us." And so this is another one where probably sort of as I'm reading the story, you can think of situations, whether it's in your personal life or in, sort of the public media sphere, you can think of, oh, okay, yeah, no, I know people that do this, right? And the moral of this story, the explicit moral is misery loves company.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that that's true, right? I think that there is this sort of urge that when you find yourself in a hard place, to find somebody else who's in the same situation because they understand you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other one that I saw in there was, examine the motives of others, right? So if somebody's telling you something, right, it might be good to dig into it a little bit and say, okay, well, why are you trying to convince me of this?
Yeah, this is one of the more complicated ones, I think, because this is going to be a side pop culture reference too, but this is a meeting of the Green Lanterns.
Yeah.
Let's gather the foxes. Well, first, that solves an implicit thing that's been going on in the other stories. When you take them in total, you just read all the fox stories and then choose some to talk about. When you read all the fox stories, you realize we're not talking about one fox. So it's more complicated. The fox with the grapes was female. This one happens to be male. But we're gathering other foxes, probably male and female, all of whom have different viewpoints. What does it mean to be fox? So this is an implied question.
Yeah.
In this, and some of the foxes are wiser than others.
Right.
In comparison with themselves.
Right.
So that runs through my head listening to that story too.
Yeah. And I think that it does represent where it gets complicated to be human, right? And it gets complicated to, it's hard to think and it's hard to examine sources and do these things. But, there's a separation there, right? If you think about Christopher Reeves or Michael J. Fox, right? These people out here that are, doing research and supporting research for diseases that they have, that would more be like the fox going out there and saying, hey, let's come up with a way to make sure that no other foxes lose their tails, right? Which is a different thing. But to go out there and try to convince everybody that not having a tail is the better way, that's like the emperor's new clothes, right?
It's very much his. And this, so, this not unexpectedly takes me to all kinds of political things.
Yeah.
This is the way. Get rid of this and you'll be better. Well, just lop off your tail. Lop off an essential part of what you are. You'll be better for it. Who needs it?
Yeah.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah. Using simplistic arguments or, examining laws that were applicable 200 years ago, or, there's a lot of
possibilities in that, which is why these stay alive. Mm-hmm. We can talk about nuclear power. We can talk about politics. We can talk about somebody in our family. We can talk, so there's a common reference. We so often lack a common reference these days. I think this is going to be dating me too, but everything does. I've often had this conversation with people of my generation and said, boy, weren't things simpler when there were like 3 channels on the television? And everybody either saw some of the same shows or chose not to watch, but there was a limited number of things to talk about with televised things. So there was a common reference for stories. Now people watch so many things that the chances of having seen the same thing at the same time are extremely diminished. Well, when you go back to Aesop, these are paragraph-long stories. These are flash fiction.
Yeah.
And so you can read and say, oh, and maybe I remember that from being a kid, or maybe I've never encountered that, but we can all read a paragraph story in the space of a couple seconds.
Yeah.
And maybe it speaks to us.
Yeah. And we're going through 8 of these, which the fox is a central character in Aesop stories, and we're probably hitting, at least half of the stories right here. So, like you said, it's not a huge investment of time to read everything there is to read about this idea within the context of Aesop's fables, and be able to have some interesting insights and thoughts about it. Yeah, so I mentioned Christopher Reed's Michael J. Fox Foundation, those sorts of things, good causes. That would be more like the foxes trying to keep their tails. I think about like celebrity things on the other side of it. Like, oh well, hey, if you take this pill, you'll be just like me. And it's like, well, you have a you have a personal chef and a professional trainer and plastic surgery and all this other stuff that money can afford for people. What are the chances that you're popping these same pills that you're telling me to pop, or these sorts of things?
This is why that's one of the prime on the list of logical fallacies. There are many names for it, but argument from a position of notoriety. Oh, I'm a sports player you all recognize. So go ahead and do this. Now, we think we're savvy enough to say, well, we're in the 21st century. We know that you got a contract. We know that, gee, I still like that guy. So
yeah.
Even when you know how the rules work, you'll say, yeah, but it doesn't apply to me because, we're good.
Right. And it makes you wonder if this fox who lost his tail, right? He'd obviously been subjected to ridicule,
right.
But it makes you psychologically, right? At some point, does he convince himself that it is more beautiful and attractive not to have a tail, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it always a ploy, just to get, other misery loves company, right? To get these other foxes to do a heated so that he's not alone? Or is there something psychologically going on where he's, like we talked about in the story before, right? Needing to be right, needing to be in that position of being the one who's right.
But I can see this story being used as a quick introduction to an audience to talk about things like having multiple ways of access to a building. Nobody in disability rights or other ability rights would be saying everybody should have to use a ramp only.
Right.
So take away your stairs. Use a ramp. But maybe one could construe the fox as putting out there, it's not easy not having a tail. Try it and then see what it does. So I think that's reading in, but I think it's possible to re-see that story that way.
Yeah. And I mean, it raises the whole specter of that anyways, this idea of disability, right? Because the fox says in his story, right? Hey, without my tail, I move through the brush much easier, right? And we see people with no legs that are banned from competing in the real Olympics because the artificial legs make them faster than normal humans. So this idea of disability, right?
Right. I think there's some marvelous things that keep coming up on my Instagram. Who knows how the algorithm works, but I'm glad that they're there. And I can't say the people's names yet because I haven't gotten a full handle on how that works. So I've just admitted my inability. But there are things where people who are in wheelchairs sometimes, or whose bodies move differently than what we call quote unquote normally, who are saying, look, am I going to stand here looking glum for the rest of my days? No, because I can do this. I can move. See me as beautiful or don't. I am, and so I can see some of that in the tale too.
Yeah. And I mean, that kind of goes back on a lot of the other tales that we've told so far.
Yeah.
All right. The next one we have is The Fox and the Mask.
I have all these marked. That's the fox and green. The fox. I lost my. Joel, I'm going to ask you to read it.
Oh, I only printed out the ones that I had.
Okay, well, hang on just a second. Fill up the time while I'm finding it.
All right.
Because I had it marked, but I lost it.
This one is pretty interesting. I don't know which version you have because I originally didn't pick this one because I read one version of it on where you had sent me online.
Right.
And then I noticed there was a second one, and I read that, and I did like that one a lot better.
Yeah, I liked. You're right. There are variations, and the one online does have It's not huge variation, but it's enough. So as soon as I get my finger on it, we'll talk about it. I should have had it memorized. I didn't. But I think the idea of revision and how we tell a story, and this is true for Arthurian stories, this is true for so many kinds, you see that in the subtleties of difference, a pretty large different meaning can be taken from it.
Especially in stories like this, because they're so short. Like The Fox and the Tail had 2 versions as well. Yep. And it's usually, I noticed where the variation is at the very beginning of the story. There's usually some difference in how the animal ended up in the situation that it's in. And that makes a really big difference. As like we were talking about the fox and the goat, makes a really big difference in the moral of the story or how you view the character, depending on how he ended up in the situation.
Yes, it does. And now I found it, and you filled that very well. It was meaningful. So The Fox and the Mask. A fox entered the house of an actor and, rummaging through all his properties, came upon a mask, an admirable imitation of a human head. He placed his paws on it and said, "What a beautiful head! Yet it is of no value as it entirely lacks brains." Now, there's a reason I like this one that I'll reveal up front, and it won't surprise you because I have the good fortune of having done some acting at college in a theater program, learning something about it. One of my adult children went through all the training at the beginning levels for this. And then I'm in the world of puppeteering as an audience member, as somebody who loves many puppeteers in this world. And so those all talk to me while I'm reading this story, because to me, this, aside from what you'll more than adequately point out as the main moral, there's a revelation of a lack of understanding on Fox's part of what masks are about. Yeah. So there's a possible Jungian analysis. There's a possible puppetry analysis. Puppetry. I interviewed a few weeks ago one of the preeminent puppeteers on the planet. Was sitting in Perry High School. Well, he and his team was working with one of the preeminent American puppeteers. And they've been friends for a long time. They were making a new show that they presented in Perry, this nice little town. But it's the formal opening of it's going to be in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Then it's going to New York. So anybody who came to see it here, they saw the nascent, the beginnings of this show. Puppeteers have this magical thing going on. It's neurocognitive. It's spiritual. It is on so many levels. We all know it's a puppet, and yet a puppeteer who in what Mr. Nishikawa, who's a 5th generation puppeteer, this kind of form is called cart puppeting. It was developed by his great grandfather. Right? It's 170 years old, and it gets modified as tools change. But essentially, puppeteers sitting in black or dark clothing. Sometimes with masks, sometimes not, to cover up the features, usually not. So you are seeing the puppet doing what it's doing. You're seeing the shadow of the puppeteer manipulating the puppet. But you're also seeing the expressions on the puppeteer's face, which is directing you right back to the puppet and revealing what's going on in the puppet. And so a mask can be used to hide. This is a superhero thing going on, right? A mask, just hide my identity. A mask can be used to distract you away from the person who's doing the manipulating. A mask can also, the mask of putting on the emotions of the thing that's being puppeteered or manipulated. Still, you know what's there. There's a humanity to a mask. Yeah. And so for the fox to say, what a beautiful head, yet no value, it entirely lacks brains, would be as much as for a person to pick up a puppet and look at it and say, there's nothing here. Yeah. Well, until the human being is moving it, at which point, I mean, my wife, who is has been a children's storyteller, library services person for decades, she often says this to me because she enjoys doing puppeteering and the simplest sock puppet. You don't even need a sock. Take your hand and say, "Oh, here comes alligator," and I'm holding my hand out here like alligator, and everybody's going to watch that hand. "Hello, I'm an alligator," and they'll say, "Yeah, what is it? What's going on, alligator?" It's on my arm, it's my hand, but somehow you've got a forum.
Yeah, and that's why I actually like the alternate version of this story better. Is because in the alternate version, the fox doesn't break into an actor's house; he actually breaks into a theater. And so as he's wandering around the theater, he sees a mask hanging up and it says that it scares him. And so he sees the mask and he is filled with fear until he realizes that it's not a person. And then the story proceeds as the same. To me, there's a little bit more. I like your version for what you're saying about the fox just completely missing the point.
But your version is much more.
Yeah, when there's that emotional connection, that brings something else out as well, which so the moral of the story, the explicit moral is outside show is a poor substitute for inner worth. Okay, we can see that, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter how good of a mask, you can have, you could create a perfect replica of a human being out of paper mache or the wax museum, right? You can go to New York, they have the wax museums, celebrities that look just like celebrities, but doesn't really mean anything if they're not alive, right? So what's on the outside doesn't matter as much as what's on the inside. All right, that's a good moral.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is something else going on with masks there, right? And I think that one that's pretty salient between you and me on a micro scale, but I think that pretty much everybody who's ever seen Star Wars on a macro scale, right, is this idea of Boba Fett, right? So without fail, there seems to be two reactions to people who saw Boba Fett, in the original trilogy, right? Yeah. Before all of this expanded universe stuff has happened.
Yep.
There's the people that said, wow, this guy just showed up and got thrown into a Sarlacc pit. What a lame character. The end. Right? There's other people that are like, wow, you know what? This character, he seems frightening and mysterious and kind of intriguing. And, they should have done something a little bit different with him. So I'm on that side of it, right? And so I 3D printed a Mandalorian helmet. And to me, there's something just in the design. Like, I don't know what it is inside my own psyche that just looks at this design, the aesthetic of this, and thinks, man, there's something that is frightening and mysterious and intriguing and cool about it. And my wife, who doesn't care about Star Wars at all, right? When I finished the helmet and I put it on for the first time, she looked at me and she goes, man, you know what? That's way more cool than it has any right to be.
Yes. And that's the nature of masks going back across indigenous cultures across the planet. I mean, I'm sitting here, you have that Mandalorian helmet sitting on the table, and I glance at it, and it's full of life. That thing watches you sometimes. Well, you could say, well, it's part of the light reflection on everything. No, there's more to it than that. It embodies something. My wife's uncle adamantly collected masks of various Native American and indigenous cultures, often was given them as gifts and so on, and treated them with some reverence. But if you walked into the room and you see that, or you go to a Ganangadan, which is one of the main conduits of indigenous culture in our area, for people coming in and taking it in, and you see a mask, there is a spirit, there is a life way beyond the individual who happens to have the honor of wearing the mask. There's a transformation. This goes on in acting, this goes on in puppeteering, this goes on with any number of permutations of masking. That's where this takes me.
Yeah, and it's almost like when you put the mask on, the line between acting and puppeteering becomes very blurred, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's something, when you put that mask on, regardless of whether or not you're still portraying a human character or a spiritual character or whatever it may be, the fact is, you're not playing yourself anymore, or you're not playing a part with the humanity behind it, because you express that with the face, right? And when you cover up the face, I think that there's something deeper about humanity that you are starting to look at.
Yeah.
When the mask or the helmet or whatever it is goes on that covers the face. And
and Fox misses that.
Yeah. He's just a fox. What can we do?
Well, I have to tell you, this is just a little side anecdote too, but it sort of dovetails with all of this. My wife and I have a fox mask that we got at the Sterling Renaissance Festival some years ago, and we've had it upstairs in a storage area. But our friends who do Shake on the Lake were gathering up various costuming materials, and we had some Renaissance stuff, and they're doing a version of Macbeth, and right now, and so I tossed in the fox mask, and as it turns out, that fox mask is being used for one of the witches. And when I see still shots, I'm going to see the production live tonight, but I see still shots. And I know who's wearing that mask. Nope. There's a transformation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really wild. All right, so next one is the fox and the woodcutter. A fox, running before the hounds, came across a woodcutter felling an oak and begged him to show him a safe place to hide. The woodcutter advised him to take shelter in his own hut, so the fox crept in and hid himself in a corner. The huntsman soon came up with the hounds and inquired of the woodcutter if he had seen the fox. He declared that he had not seen him, and yet pointed all the time he was speaking to the hut where the fox lay hidden. The huntsman took no notice of the signs, but believing his word, hastened forward in the chase. As soon as they were well away, the fox departed without taking any notice of the woodcutter. Whereon the woodcutter called to him and reproached him, saying, "You ungrateful fellow, you owe your life to me, and yet you leave me without a word of thanks." The fox replied, "Indeed, I should have thanked you fervently if your deeds had been as good as your words, and if your hands had not been traitors to your speech."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the explicit moral here is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And yeah, this again is something that all of us, as soon as you hear the story, you can think of scenarios that have happened to you that follow this, right? Somebody who is, what's a good expression? Like talking out of both sides of their mouth.
Right. Which itself, if you just think of it as an expression, and you picture somebody doing it, hey, look, this is what's going on. Oh, yeah, over here. This is like, it's goofy.
Right.
It's goofy. It's like saying lying through your teeth. Well, how else are you going to?
Yeah.
But if you, for an oral culture, but this one I read this, I thought about this one. There's a classic philosophical paradigm or model. Are you always bound to tell the truth? And so what if your duty? And so we're deontological. Do I always have a duty to the truth? Well, if so, taken to its logical conclusion, if a friend of yours came to your apartment, knocked on the door, ran, hide me, somebody's trying to kill me. Okay, all right, I'll hide you behind the bed. And a person knocks on the door and says, have you seen X? Yes. Oh, he's hiding behind the bed. Well, because after all, I told the truth. And that model brings up exactly, well, which truth are we, and so then we get into a collision of a larger need, the needs of the many as opposed to the needs of the few, or, brings up all those things. This fox tale does that. And it's interesting because it puts the fox in the seat of utter wisdom about human nature. The fox is in the controlling seat on this one. The fox could have died. The fox saw it all going on. It wasn't like the fox was just missing.
Right. Sometimes
a fox, because it's not all the same fox in the story. This is probably the fox that says, you're trying to get us to cut off our tails.
Yeah.
This is the fox that says, I see what you're doing.
Yeah.
Why should I thank you when you were trying to get the guy to get me?
Right. Yeah, and I read the wrong moral. I was down one too far. The moral was there's as much malice in a wink as in a word. Yeah, and that really does sort of encapsulate the story. And yeah, it makes you think of deeper philosophical themes that we've talked about, like verisimilitude, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, if the fox is operating under a false premise, an untruthful premise, the woodcutter is operating under an untruthful premise, and the houndsman is operating under an untruthful premise. All of them only have a piece of the truth, right? Well, is any one of them right in the action that they take? If none of them know what the truth of this situation between the three of them is,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's again another one of those deeply interesting stories, and this one does portray the fox differently from a lot of the other stories. All right, so last one, the fox and the crane.
Let's see if I can not disappoint the way I did the last time, because I did have all of these marked out. Now I will say that I marked out some of the ones that we didn't talk about. The fox and the crane. This is slightly longer, not too much. A fox invited a crane to supper and provided nothing for his entertainment but some soup made of pulse, which was poured out into a broad, flat stone dish. The soup fell out of the long bill of the crane at every mouthful, and his vexation at not being able to eat afforded the fox much amusement. The crane, in his turn, asked the fox to sup with him, and set before her a flagon with a long, narrow mouth, so that he could easily insert his neck and enjoy its contents at his leisure. The fox, unable even to taste it, met with a fitting requital after the fashion of her own hospitality.
So the moral of this one is do unto others as they'd have him do unto you.
Yes.
But yeah. I think that the other one that I saw in there was essentially what goes around comes around.
Yeah. And it brings up the innate cruelty of human beings. And I say innate because it can be overcome, but I think it's hard to argue that it's not there. And there's so much of this that runs through the culture. People get upset because, well, we can't tell the jokes we used to tell because somebody's going to be hurt by them. Yeah, so is that so bad? I mean, how about we adjust our humor so we can still tell truths about things without having to batter somebody?
Right.
But that takes me to that particular scenario because I've heard it many times over the past couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that there's an important distinction to draw with these things, right? Because I think that one that you just pointed out is the moral of this story. I think that the fox originally did what he did with intent, with purpose, for amusement, right? Mm-hmm. And that is a direct parallel to what you were just saying, which is something that is prevalent everywhere. I constantly have to deal with it at work, telling people, hey, listen, you can't do that, because, what might be funny to you is actively harmful to somebody else. You might think it's funny that the crane can't eat, but you need to eat to live, essentially, right?
You've got, and so, of course, my mind went immediately, because I love comedy, went to Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle, who have just been pounding on the trans community. There's no amusement here. This is utter cruelty, and they're being called out for this by a lot of people. But to me, there's no difference essentially between what they're doing and what Fox does. You can't eat. Watch me eat my food. Yeah. Oh, now in one meal, the crane's not going to expire. But the point is, you explicitly invited and then said no.
Yeah, and that's why I think that what goes around comes around is an important addendum to the do unto others as they do unto you. Because there's another fable about the fox that we didn't read, the fox and the eagle. And this one is slightly darker, but it has sort of the same message where the fox and the eagle were friends. They decided that they would raise their prospective offspring nearby. Then one day when the fox is out getting food, the eagle said, well, my little eagles are hungry, so I'm just going to scoop up a fox cub and eat it. And the fox was very upset, but had no way of retaliating against the eagle. And then the eagle later on went to find some more food for its eaglets, and it scooped down and picked up a piece of goat, but that piece of goat was on a human altar of sacrifice. So the humans were sacrificing this goat in a religious ceremony. So they took great offense to it and, went and burned down the eagle's nest. Mm-hmm. And the eagle's babies fell out of the nest and the fox gobbled them up. Yep. So that is the what goes around comes around story. Very dark. But again, I think that it is an important part of the moral, because if you're doing unto others as they do unto you, that sort of thing will follow you in some regard. And I'm not talking about a karmic sort of follow you, but we all have, at any point, any of us could be subject to cruel treatment by any person, right? Yeah. But within our personal spheres of relationships that we have, we can establish a relationship, we can establish an expectation of behavior. And if the expectation that we set for people is that we are going to be kind, we're going to be generous, we're going to be these things, then they tend to repay them that way. And they tend to discourage or shun people who might not be familiar with your way of doing things, from treating you badly, right? Mm-hmm. So there's almost a peer pressure to treat people as they deserve to be treated based off of the people who know them best. Right? Yeah. And so you can see that in these stories, the fox and the crane could have gone along being good friends and eating supper together and doing these things if the expectation had been set that they were going to have an equanimous relationship.
Yep. And this one, your pairing of those two stories, the additional one that you related, this takes you back to thinking about fables themselves, which are anthropomorphized incredibly. The fox would have tried to eat the crane. The crane would have gotten away. They're not making soup. but in the eagle one, this is nature. When the philosophers talked in the 1700s, 1800s about nature, human nature, as well as all of nature, being red of tooth and claw. Yeah, the eagle would eat a fox, and when the nest comes down, the fox would eat the eagles, because that's how it works.
Yeah, and there are Aesop's fables that portray that moral. Again, two other ones we didn't use. I think it was the fox, the dogs, and the lion, where there's a dead lion and the dogs are eating it, and the fox comes by and says, "If only that lion were alive, you would have found that his claws are much sharper than your teeth." Right? That's a natural moral if you've ever heard one. Mm-hmm. Another one was what was the other one? It was the fox and the lion. A live lion is in a cage, and the fox despises him, says, "Oh, look how sad you are. What a shame." And the lion says, "You don't despise me, you despise the situation that I'm in." Meaning that if the lion were free, the fox would not be talking to him this way. So
yes, you just, because this is what this is, this game that we're playing. We took my granddaughter to the zoo a few times over the past number of months, and up in Rochester. And as zoos go, it doesn't feel cruel. I know there are all kinds of arguments about zoos, but there is the lion exhibit, which you see. This is why these are so good, because they trigger memories. Right? Have you been to the Rochester Zoo? Yeah. So the lion exhibit, it's wonderful large stones. All the kids think it looks like Lion King because there's a great big hill with it. But there's a tour bus that's put inside. You can walk in the tour bus, and often there's a female lion, a lioness, sitting on the hood. And you walk up and you look through the window, and you're right there seeing the lion is an inch of glass between you and the lion. And everybody says, "Oh, wow, this is great. Boy, it could get me." Yeah, it could break that glass and get you. And so thank you, lion, for not being so hungry you wanted to. Thank you, zoo, for keeping the lions fed. But, we like to walk this edge where we think we're being so clever. And that doesn't always work out well.
Yeah, and again, this is where the morals, we can look at them on a micro scale, right? So with the fox and the eagle, the eagle takes advantage of the fox, and the fox has no way of retaliating, but the eagle eventually is retaliated against. It's the same thing if we look at it at a macro scale again, right? We look at these lions, we look at them in this situation and think, oh, wow, they're scary, but, we're clever. We've established this thing so they can't get to us. But then we zoom out and we see that we're actively destroying their habitat, and in also conjunction our own habitat, right? And so the retaliation is there for assuming a dominant stance over nature in the way that we're doing it. So
yeah, exactly. It's a climate fable.
Yeah.
Which Aesop wouldn't have thought of.
Right. So
if there had been an Aesop.
So this is, I guess this is a rare situation where the human and animal relationships are sort of even out, right? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's not merely talking to human, but also kind of human to nature, right? You have to do unto nature as you want nature to do unto you. If you're not going to treat it respectfully or treat it as if it's something that has a fragile balance in an ecosystem in a way that needs to be approached, it's not going to provide that fragile ecosystem.
And you think and this, you're right. The fables being animals with human characteristics, it's not hard at all to turn that around and say humans with animal characteristics. We can get in. I think we're going to be doing more of this next week, right?
Yeah, that's the thing is I had a bunch of questions to ask about the fox, but we're short on time.
Yeah.
And honestly, a lot of these questions don't apply just to the fox, but it's sort of examining the nature of animals in the fables as a whole. So we can save it for another episode where we have a little bit more time. Okay. Maybe one of the animals that has a few less fables associated with it. Okay. But I think for this episode, I think it went really well. I had a lot of fun looking at them all.
Yeah, me too.
And we'll keep going with the series next week. So until next time, keep hunting.